makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Before I start this video, I want to give a massive, massive thanks because this channel just hit 100 subscribers. This is the first video that I do after we hit the 100 subscriber threshold. And I am really, really happy about this. And I just want to thank all of you who have subscribed from the bottom of my heart. This channel, I started it, I think it was probably either late March or early April. I'm not quite sure. I actually don't remember the day that I started it. And initially I just was sort of trying out streaming and trying out videos, learning how to use OBS, and I promoted it just with a small circle of friends. And it really wasn't until May 1st that I started promoting it outside of Facebook and to a wider audience as well within Facebook. So it's amazing because from what I read, it takes about 3 months to get to 100 subscribers, and I did it. We did it in 20 days. So that's pretty amazing. And the reason I wanted to get to 100 was because with 100 you can get a custom URL. So hopefully I'll be able to promote this now with a custom URL. I still need to get the proper authorization from YouTube, but this should happen in the next couple of days, or hopefully not weeks. But yeah, this is great. So again, thank you very, very much, and I guarantee you there'll be more. If you subscribe because of the content that you've liked so far, I guarantee you there's going to be more and more and more and more. So, having said that, now let's move on to the topic of discussion, which is there is something that probably many people have noticed, many of you have noticed, that right-wingers tend to be very, very strongly pro-Israel, while at the same time being incredibly anti-Semitic. And you might wonder, how do you do that? What are the mental gymnastics that you need to justify being so pro-Israel while at the same time promoting, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, blaming George Soros for everything that's wrong in the world, chanting Jews will not replace us if you went to the Charlottesville rally, which I hope none of you listening to this went to. How do you get away with this? How do you mentally justify these two apparently contradictory things? Now, before I start with the actual meat of this discussion, I need to point out that at least in theory, there is nothing contradictory about this, because obviously Israel and Jews are not the same. And in fact, one of the characteristics of the acceptable definition of anti-Semitism is that you should not automatically assume that any Jewish person agrees with the policies of the Israeli state. And I think this is hugely important, because, well, first and foremost, I know a lot of Jewish people who don't support what the Israeli state does, especially the occupation and brutality against Palestinians. So there is a lot of Jewish people who don't support this, just as there are, of course, a lot of Jewish people who do. So it doesn't the intrinsic support for Israel does not depend on whether you are Jewish or not Jewish. So the other reason that this is important is because we shouldn't be compelled to do this to any other person or any other ethnicity or race or religion. It's bad regardless of who you're dealing with. And I say this because, for example, it is not uncommon, or at least it was not uncommon back in the day when there were more Islamic terror attacks, that all Muslims should condemn Islamic terrorism done in their name. And the answer is no, they shouldn't. You're not responsible for what people do halfway around the world. Plain and simple. Just because you share their religion or maybe their ethnicity, you don't need to condemn any action done in your name, just because this is guilt by association, which is a fallacy. So let's just make that clear. Jewish people should never have to justify anything that Israel does. Okay? And by that logic, we understand that there is a difference between Israel and Jewish people. So from that kind of, I would say, semantic argument, there really should be nothing contradictory of being pro-Israel and yet being anti-Semitic. But we all kind of know that that's not true. We all know that there's other reasons why they likely do this. So the focus of my video is on Marjorie Taylor Greene. And if you follow US politics, you probably know who she is. She is probably one of the most batshit insane people in Trump land. And I'm going to show you her Wikipedia page. Greene has supported disproven far-right conspiracy theories such as Pizzagate and QAnon, as well as other unevidenced conspiracy theories, including false flag shootings and 9/11 conspiracy theories. Additionally, before running for Congress, she supported the execution of prominent Democratic politicians. Greene also supported Trump's efforts to overturn his loss to Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential elections. So, you got the idea of who we're dealing with, right? And the craziest thing about this is she's not even like a state legislator. She's in the federal U.S. House of Representatives. So, she's a nutcase on a national level. And the bar is high for being a far-right nutter these days. Everyone is trying to out-insane the other one. But I think she's probably the worst. I mean, you'll struggle to find someone in a position of public office as high as hers, this crazy and lunatic. So the reason I'm mentioning her is because she made a few tweets that are quite interesting. So let's look. Jewish lives matter. So tell your terrorist buddies in Hamas to stop bombing them. #JihadSquad. This in response to a comment by Ilhan Omar, another congressperson, who said, Palestinian lives matter, pass it on. Which I don't think is controversial in any way. Now, check the date, May 17, and let's see what she wrote the following day. Being woke is a religious cult. Bowing to the false god of social, racial, and climate justice in the freest country in the world is a fool's pursuit. It leads to devastating socialism and communism, or some awful form of both. George Soros is the father of it, and he funds it. So, there you go. One day you are saying Jewish lives matter, and the next day you are basically blaming George Soros for wokeness and socialism and communism. And we all know that this is a massive conspiracy theory. George Soros may be incredibly active in supporting some, I wouldn't say progressive causes, because he's not really progressive. He's sort of, progressive kind of, promotes sort of standard establishment democratic policies. He's not really left in any way. He's a freaking hedge fund manager, for Christ's sakes. He's not left wing. I mean, I personally don't care much about him. I don't think he's too important. He's also not that as wealthy as people think he is. If you look at any Forbes list of the richest people in the world, he is very, 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 you'll have to search for him. He's not in the top 10. He's not in the top 50. I don't think he's even in the top 100. And I think, so he divested some of his personal wealth because he put it into Open Democracy, which is his foundation. So it might, if you look at him now and like to the more recent Forbes lists, he might be lower than he was before this divestment, which I don't know what year it was. I didn't research it. But even if I recall looking to see the size of his wealth before this divestment in the past, and it also wasn't huge. So he's never been a Jeff Bezos or a Mark Zuckerberg by any stretch of the imagination. So this is a conspiracy theory, and it's an anti-Semitic one because it echoes a Nazi trope that was that socialism was a Jewish ideology. And I don't know where this comes from because Marx wasn't Jew. I think his family was Jewish. secular Jewish. But he was not Jewish. And I think, if anything, one of the more problematic aspects of Marx is that he made some anti-Semitic comments. And so it's hard to really say that socialism is a Jewish ideology in any way. So it's not just repeating a conspiracy theory, it's repeating a Nazi conspiracy theory, which is even more awful. But anyway, there you have it. Space of 24 hours, that's 2 separate tweets, a pro-Israel and anti-Semitic one. So how does she get away with it? Like, what are the mental gymnastics that you need to think like this? And the first point, I think, is kind of like a utilitarian one. I think right-wingers have a pyramid of evil in which certain groups that they hate are more evil than others. And so if you support one of those groups that is fighting another group that's higher on this pyramid, then you might feel compelled to support them. And you might get the impression from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene that satanic pedophiles in the Democratic Party are at the top of the pyramid of evil, but I don't think that's the case. I think for most conservatives today, most American conservatives, Muslims are probably at the top of that list, especially after 9/11. So by this logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, it's not surprising that they support Israel, which essentially does the US's work against Muslims in the Middle East. So that, I think, is a very sort of superficial utilitarian reason why they might not see this as contradictory in any way. But I do think there's more. I do think there's a psychological reason behind this. And that is that far-right conservatism values hierarchies. They value authority and the use of force, even oppressive force, in maintaining those authorities. So if you look back, and there's been measurements of far-right authoritarianism since Theodor Adorno conceptualized this idea after World War II. This was done to explain why so many normal Germans ended up supporting the Nazis. And so he came up with something called the F scale, like a fascism scale, to describe the degree of far-right authoritarianism. And later other researchers improved upon this. There's one famous one from Bob Altemeyer. He's a researcher who's done a lot of work on right-wing authoritarianism, and he developed the RWA scale. Now, I think a lot of conservatives today, especially the modern brand of kind of alt-right inspired conservatism, Trump-supporting conservatism, they probably share a lot of traits with right-wing authoritarians. And this includes these factors such as power and toughness in leaders. And I'm going to link this in the description so you can all test how right-wing authoritarian you are. Hopefully you don't. Hopefully the people who follow me, these 100 subscribers or any new subscribers, don't score highly on this test. I really hope. Let's look at some of the questions in this test. The established authorities generally turned out to be right about things, while the radicals and protesters are usually just loudmouths showing off their ignorance. Our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what he has to do to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. It is always better to trust the judgment of the proper authorities in government and religion than to listen to the noisy rabble-rousers in our society who are trying to create doubt in people's minds. The only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values and put some tough leaders in power and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. See where I'm going with this? You can start getting the idea of this idea. If you strongly disagree with these, if you strongly agree with these statements, you're probably a far-right authoritarian. And if you think about it, Israel's oppression of Palestinians is probably the best example in the world right now of this kind of authority being imposed on another. And it would seem to me that a lot of conservatives would love to get away with what Israel is doing against Palestinians, to be able to get away with it with their own enemies. And a great example of this is Tom Cotton's infamous New York Times op-ed, where he argues, send in the troops. The nation must restore order. The military stands ready. An overwhelming show of force. So see how this is intrinsic to kind of modern conservative ideology. I definitely think that, this is what they would want to do. What Israel is doing to Palestinians is what they would want the government to do against Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters. They would love to see immigrants in cages, as happened during Trump. So this very punitive view of justice, supported by this idea that hierarchies and authority are legitimate just because they exist, and clearly because they benefit you, is part of this ideology. And another really interesting study was done. So the link between Brexit and the death penalty, which you would think shouldn't exist because the death penalty really wasn't part of the Brexit debate. But as it turns out, something like 70% of people who voted for Brexit supported the death penalty. That's crazy. In fact, and I'm not sure if it's in this article, but in the original study, which I did read, I think it's sort of the second or the third characteristic of a Brexit voter that has most explanatory power, even more than income and class. So we have this idea that people voted Brexit because of anger at the system, sort of economic malaise, etc. Same reason why people voted for Trump. But in fact, we see here that support for the death penalty was a better explanatory variable than income. So there's definitely a cultural aspect, and more than culture, I would say a personality aspect. So you can see how this right-wing authoritarian personality really affects politics in many ways. And I genuinely don't think that there's no more consistent descriptor of conservative ideology than authority, hierarchies, and their imposition by whatever means necessary, especially against those that you see as degenerate or inhuman, which I think a lot of conservatives must definitely see Muslims that way. So if you think about it, this is like the utilitarian argument. I don't think the psychological one is very contradictory in any way. The real contradiction, I think, is that a lot of these conservatives, they also see themselves as victims of cancel culture, of wokeness, of postmodern cultural neo-Marxism, as Jordan Peterson would describe it, which actually is the reason why I think Jordan Peterson is one of the most dangerous ones, one of the more dangerous pundits or public figures in the alt-right, precisely because no one does the same amount of effort that he does in legitimizing hierarchies. And to the extreme, you end up with things like feeling that you're a victim of white genocide, which we all know is ridiculous. But a lot of people in the far right promote this idea. So you would think that there's also some degree of psychological projection here. If you legitimize the behavior of Israel towards Palestinians, to some extent you can end up justifying your own feelings of victimization. And this is this idea of psychological projection is why, for example, a lot of victims of childhood abuse later grow up and replicate that in adulthood to their own children. But I'm not hugely convinced by it, to be honest. I'm bringing it up just as a possibility that this might be a factor. I'm honestly not hugely in favor of this argument, because I don't think that conservatives genuinely feel that they are victims, and that they're using this only as an argumentative point. I do think there is some degree of, I would say, legitimate victimization over economic conditions, for example. Perceptions of lack of opportunities, etc. That in that sense, I do think there is their feeling of victimhood is legitimate. They definitely feel that, and actually, I would tend to some extent agree, not from like a racial perspective, but from a class-based perspective, because poor white people are screwed over by the economic system. That's a fact. In that sense, I definitely sympathize with them. But yeah, I don't think this projection argument, like I said, I'm just bringing it up for discussion. But I do think the other points stand. I think the utilitarian argument, and especially the psychological argument, related to their support for authority and imposing force against the rabble-rousers, etc. This is a very punitive mentality, a punitive view of justice that conservatives, to some degree, have always had. I think now it's just more amplified because so much more of conservatives are far-right conservatives as they were in the past. Centrist, the center-right is dead these days. I don't think it exists as a major political force in any way. And if we look back at her statements of like supporting the execution of prominent Democratic politicians, this fits right in. And if you view like Palestinian protesters as rabble-rousers, and it's all so perfectly in line with the questions that we've seen in these tests. So yeah, I definitely think that in a conservative utopia, you'd be able to drop smart bombs on Antifa and put all immigrants in an open-air prison like Gaza. And all the while, you're also blaming George Soros for your misery. So I do think that is what a lot of conservatives would like. And that is the reason why I think they can get away with this idea of being incredibly anti-Semitic while at the same time supporting Israel. But this is just conjecture, obviously. I would love to hear what you all have to say about this, so feel free to comment below, and yeah, let's have a conversation. Having said that, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning of the video. Huge thanks for subscribing. I hope to promote the new URL whenever it's authorized. And if you like this video, like, share, subscribe. All new subscribers, I'm hugely in gratitude to. And this is a new channel. Let's look at getting to 1,000. Thanks again for watching.